I'm Andrew Warnes. I'm a reader in American Studies at the School of English, the University of Leeds. And the subject of this podcast is going to be The Great Gatsby and the Roaring Twenties. So it'll be taking a somewhat sort of historical approach to Fitzgerald's novel. The purpose, I guess, is to sort of try to make that time period come alive to you as students. Whether I'll achieve that or not, we shall see. But I hope you'll agree with me that when faced with that kind of challenge, historians often tend to place particular emphasis on relevance, on the similarities between a particular historical period and the present day. So we often hear the phrase, just like us, facilitating this. One historian might say that the Romans had underfloor heating and indoor plumbing just like us. Another historian might say the Victorian press were just as fond of a good old-fashioned sex scandal as the hacks of Wapping are today. In these kinds of cases, and for obvious reasons, the identification of continuities between the past and the present appears the best way of introducing audiences to historical periods that might otherwise seem forbiddingly unfamiliar. The temptation to take exactly this approach to the Roaring Twenties is strong. On the face of it, there are many similarities that we can choose from. Indeed, when we consider many aspects of 1920s American life, that phrase, just like us, springs readily to mind. In the early years of the 1920s, the years in which Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby, Americans experienced bewildering technological change, for example. So just as the gadgets that we used just 10 years ago, from DVD recorders to disk drives, now seem shockingly obsolete to us, so many Americans in these years, the years immediately after the Great War, first acquired a set of household devices that rendered earlier equipment redundant. Much of what the historian David Nye has called the electrification of America took place in these years. And as a result, many middle-class Americans acquired things like vacuum cleaners, which replaced various forgotten manual floor cleaners, even as telephones became more and more affordable and began to supplant the telegraph system that had seemed nothing short of miraculous only a few generations before. So, in other words, you can easily talk up the relevance that The Great Gatsby has for us. Everyone these days knows someone who has to have everything, who queued up for the latest iPad when it first came out, and who perhaps drives a flash car. And in many ways, Gatsby is this sort of person for Nick Carraway. When Nick talks about Gatsby's gorgeous car, or reports that his house was so thoroughly illuminated that it looked like it was on fire. You're talking here about quite a recognisable and familiar character, someone who has it all and wants everyone to know. And unfortunately these days I think we all know someone who's a bit like that. Other parallels can be drawn. In occasional allusions, The Great Gatsby makes it apparent that, just like us, Americans in the Roaring Twenties were divided by their experiences of and their attitudes towards mass immigration. Tom Buchanan is one of literature's great simpletons. He's a sort of serious American reply to P.G. Wodehouse's Bertie Wooster. And at one point, Nick says of Tom that there is no confusion like the confusion of a simple mind. And immigration is definitely an issue that can bring him to this point. The Great Gatsby makes us see that Tom keeps banging on and on about the supremacy of white people, but he never seems to quite realise that he himself isn't exactly the sharpest knife in the drawer. So here too we find parallels with today, and Tom's way of talking as though, quote, he saw himself standing alone on the last barrier of civilization, end quote, might well make us think of some of the Little Englanders of our own time. Identifying parallels between 1920s America and Britain today, then, isn't too difficult. And I think that a lot of school and university teachers would agree that such an approach can work wonders when introducing students to new or unfamiliar areas. But I think that many would be quick to add that this approach carries certain dangers, and that it potentially reduces our understanding of the past to the slightly simplistic question of whether it was like or unlike the present day. Spotting similarities in this sense simplifies and can become a way of avoiding the radical difference and the radical complexity that is the proper stuff of historical investigation. So it is with the connections that I've already mentioned. Although The Great Gatsby's brief mentions of immigration do indeed resonate with the situation in Britain today, for example, it's important to add that the novel's portrayals of Jewish and black characters also reflect some of the racial stereotypes of the period. In the same way, to remark that the 1920s were like our own time, a period of dizzying, bewildering technological change, raises, I would say, as many questions as it answers. The constant nervousness that Fitzgerald inflicts upon all his characters, even on simple-minded Tom Buchanan, might seem to anticipate the restless and the frenetic pace of life and of technological change today. But it's important to recognise that in the 1920s, new technological devices were still being embraced as objects that might reduce workload, particularly domestic chores, and thus ease the pressure of life. Advertising back then, in other words, struck a very different tone to that which sells smartphones and the like today. It emphasised convenience and ease as well as newness, offering a life of leisure as a dream rather than a dream of infinite connection. Again then, an apparent connection that we might discern in The Great Gatsby leads us to encounter some subtle but very significant differences. So I hope it's clear that the focus on parallels between past and present can be a useful way to approach unfamiliar historical periods, but that it works best as the opening step in a journey that then leads us from the familiar to the unfamiliar, that leads us right into the complexity of a completely different social scene. It's in just this spirit that I'd like to turn now to another area of commonality that I want to focus on for the rest of this podcast. Because it surely hasn't escaped our attention that I haven't even mentioned yet the most obvious resemblance we can find between Gatsby's setting and our own time period. Fitzgerald's novel is, after all, the story of millionaires, of the super rich, and if we were to transplant it to our own society, we'd surely have to set it in Canary Wharf, City of London, and we'd have to draw our cast from the very small circle of privileged men who now seem to run our country. It's certainly the case that many of the phrases and concepts that have come to prominence over the depressing course of the credit crunch would have had a familiar ring to Fitzgerald. In this vein, let me just quote the historian Steve Fraser's account of The Great Gatsby.